The stagecoach bucked and swayed, a wooden cage on weary wheels that had churned dust for 7 days straight. Inside, Clara Mae Thompson sat ramrod straight on the cracked leather bench, her spine a testament to a will that had refused to bend, even as everything else in her life had broken. The Wyoming wind, a relentless beast, clawed at the coach's canvas flaps, whispering through the seams with a mournful sound that mirrored the hollow ache in her chest. Her dress, a simple gray wool, was coated in the fine, pale dust of 3 territories, a film that covered her from the worn toes of her boots to the tightly pinned bun of her dark hair. She felt the grit on her teeth. For a week, she had been the sole female passenger, a silent specter among tired prospectors and a foul-smelling fur trapper who snored with his mouth agape. They had tried to speak to her in the beginning, their voices rough with curiosity, their eyes lingering on the gaunt beauty of her face, the deep-set sorrow in her dark eyes. Her answers were clipped, her voice a tight, unused thing. And soon enough they left her to her silence. They did not know that silence was her only sanctuary, the one place the ghosts could not scream so loudly. She kept her left hand tucked inside the folds of her skirt, the knuckles pressed against her thigh. The faint indentation on her 3rd finger was a brand no one could see, a pale ghost of a promise that had become a curse. She had taken the ring off the day she'd buried Thomas, dropping the thin gold band into the collection plate at a church she never planned to enter again. It felt like a lie on her finger, a shackle to a life that had been a different kind of prison. Finally, the coach slowed, its groaning timbers a sign of surrender. The driver called out a name that sounded more like a cough than a town. Redemption! Clara peered through the grimy window. Redemption. Wyoming was less a town and more a wound on the vast, empty landscape. A single, wide street, ankle-deep in mud from a recent rain, was flanked by a handful of squat, false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung with a tired rhythm, a livery, and a blacksmith's forge that coughed black smoke into the steel-gray sky. The mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and indifferent, their peaks dusted with a premature snow. There was no redemption here. There was only dirt and distance. As she stepped down, her legs unsteady, she clutched the single, worn carpet bag that held all that was left of her life. The few townsfolk who were out stopped to stare. A woman, alone, descending from a stagecoach with no one to greet her, was a spectacle. She felt their eyes on her, a familiar prickling sensation. They saw the dust, the exhaustion, the set of her jaw. They saw a story, and they would write it themselves if she did not give them one. She would give them nothing. Her destination was a cabin on the far edge of this forsaken place. It had belonged to Thomas's cousin, Silas, a man she'd never met, who had died of a fever 2 months prior. The letter from the town's preacher had been terse, informing her of the property left in her late husband's name. It was an inheritance of ruin, but it was a place to go, a place to be unseen. The cabin was worse than she imagined. It sagged to one side like an old man with a bad hip. The wood was weathered to the color of bone, and the windows were dark, vacant eyes. A wooden shutter hung from a single hinge, banging a forlorn rhythm against the wall in the ceaseless wind. The land around it was fallow, choked with sagebrush and thistle. It was a place where things came to die. "Perfect," she whispered, the word a puff of cold air. She pushed open the door, which scraped against the floorboards with a pained groan. The inside was one small room, thick with the smell of dust, disuse, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a thin, stained mattress its only comfort. A stone hearth, black with soot, dominated the far wall, and a rickety table with one chair stood in the center. She dropped her bag on the floor, sending a cloud of dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light piercing the gloom. This was her life now, this small, broken box under an endless, uncaring sky. She had asked for nothing more. That first night, sleep did not come. Every creak of the old cabin, every howl of the wind, was the sound of a footstep in the dark. She lay on the lumpy cot, her eyes wide open, and the memories came, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. Thomas, his face flushed with whiskey, his eyes holding a dangerous gleam. He stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole in the dim lamplight of their Kansas home. "It's your fault," he'd slurred, his voice thick with a rage that was always simmering just beneath the surface. "You're barren ground. Clara, nothing good can grow in you." She had been curled on their bed, the cramp still tearing through her, the blood still a stark, terrible stain on the sheets. She had lost their child only hours before. A boy, the midwife had said. She'd felt the life leave her in a wrenching, final spasm, and with it, a part of her own soul had shriveled and died. She had wanted to scream, to rage, to claw at the emptiness inside her. But Thomas's words froze the sound in her throat. He hadn't been there when it happened. He was at the saloon, as always, his laughter echoing down the street while she bled her future away. When he came home, drunk and stumbling, and saw the midwife leaving with a grim face, his grief had curdled instantly into blame. It was easier for him to have a target for his sorrow, and she was always the closest one. "A man needs a son," he'd said, his finger jabbing at the air near her face. "And you can't even do that right." She had closed her eyes, turning her face to the wall, wishing the darkness would swallow her whole. The memory of his words was a brand on her heart, a festering wound that had never healed. Weeks later, the saloon had finally claimed him. The fight had been over a card game, some perceived slight that a sober man would have ignored. But Thomas, fueled by cheap liquor and a lifetime of resentments, had drawn his pistol. He was too slow. The other man, a drifter with cold eyes, was faster. The shot had echoed through the town, a definitive, final punctuation to their miserable life together. Clara had not cried when the sheriff brought her the news. She had felt a profound, terrifying emptiness, a silence where the constant, low-grade fear had lived for so long. The whispers started almost immediately. The women of the town, who had always looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, now stared with open condemnation. They spoke in hushed tones behind their hands at the mercantile, their words like stones. "A blessing, really." He was a brute, but she drove him to it. "There was another man, I heard." The rumors were poison, seeping into the cracks of her grief, twisting her loss into shame. She was not just a widow. She was a scandal. The woman whose husband was shot down in a saloon. The woman who couldn't carry a child. The cursed woman. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in pale, washed-out colors. Clara pushed herself up from the cot, her body stiff, her mind weary. She would not be broken by memories. She would work. Work was the only prayer she had left. She spent the day in a fever of activity. She swept the floor, the bristles of the worn broom kicking up years of dirt. She scrubbed the grime from the single window until a watery light could finally filter through. She found a bucket and hauled water from the creek that ran 100 yards behind the cabin, her arms aching with the unfamiliar strain. The townsfolk kept their distance, but she felt their eyes. When she walked to the general store to buy flour, salt, and a sack of beans, the proprietor, a stout man with a suspicious squint, barely met her gaze. The women who were inside fell silent when she entered, their chatter dying on their lips. They turned their backs, pretending to be absorbed in bolts of calico. Clara's face remained a stony mask. She paid for her goods, her back straight, and walked out without a word. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. "The cursed widow," she heard one of them mutter, just loud enough for her to hear. The name clung to her. It was a shroud she couldn't cast off. Back in the perceived safety of her cabin, she looked at her reflection in the murky glass of the window. A pale face, thin and drawn. Eyes that had seen too much. A mouth that had forgotten how to smile. She saw a woman haunted by ghosts. A woman who had built a wall of silence and solitude around herself. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass. "No man can fix me," she whispered to the stranger in the reflection. It wasn't a lament. It was a vow. A few days later, a man appeared at the edge of her property. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dusty work shirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his long legs eating up the ground. He was helping another man, a local ranch hand, mend a stretch of barbed wire fence that marked the boundary between her small, useless plot and the vast grazing lands beyond. She watched him from her doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. He never looked her way, but she felt he was aware of her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them on the wind. He had a quietness about him, a stillness that was unusual in a man of his size and strength. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, with the lines etched around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent squinting into the distance. His hands, as he twisted the wire, were large and calloused, but they moved with a surprising dexterity. He wore his hat low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the weary set of his jaw. He looked as tired as she felt, as if he, too, carried a weight that couldn't be seen. Her eyes were drawn back to the shutter, still banging its irritating rhythm against the side of the cabin. It was a small thing, but it represented everything that was broken, everything she had to fix alone. She marched outside, her jaw set with determination. She grabbed the heavy wooden shutter, trying to lift it back onto the top hinge. It was heavier than it looked, awkward and unwieldy. She grunted with effort, her fingers straining, her muscles screaming in protest. The wood scraped against the cabin wall, refusing to align with the rusted hinge. "Ma'am," the voice was low and quiet, right behind her. She jumped, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't heard him approach. It was the tall cowboy. He had taken off his hat, holding it in his hands. His hair was the color of sun-bleached hay, and his eyes, now that she could see them, were a startlingly clear shade of blue, though clouded with a deep-seated weariness. "Looks like you could use a hand with that," he said. It wasn't a question or an order, just a simple statement of fact. Her defensiveness rose like a physical barrier, hot and sharp. The offer of help felt like an accusation of weakness. She had been weak once, had relied on a man, and it had nearly destroyed her. Never again. "I can manage," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. She turned back to the shutter, giving it another desperate heave. It slipped from her grasp, crashing against the wall and barely missing her foot. A frustrated sob caught in her throat. The cowboy said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence a silent rebuke to her stubborn pride. She could feel his quiet gaze on her back. Humiliation burned her cheeks. Without looking at him, she spun around, stalked back into her cabin, and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. She leaned against the rough wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She had been rude, irrational, but she didn't care. She wanted him gone. She wanted everyone gone. One night, the sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, rose to a furious, shrieking howl. The cabin groaned under the assault, the timbers creaking as if the whole structure might be torn from its foundations. Clara sat at the small table, a single candle flame flickering wildly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside was a mirror of the tempest in her soul. Then came a sound that was not the wind, a terrible, splintering crack, followed by a loud crash from behind the cabin. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She grabbed the old iron poker from the hearth, her only weapon, and crept to the door. Peering through a crack, she could see nothing but a swirling vortex of rain and darkness. Steeling herself, She pulled her thin shawl tighter and stepped outside. The wind tore at her, plastering her dress to her body, whipping her hair from its pins. The rain was icy, coming down in hard, driving sheets. Stumbling toward the back of the cabin, she saw the source of the noise. The roof of the small, dilapidated shed where Silas had stored his tools had been ripped clean off, the pieces scattered across the yard like broken bones. The contents were exposed to the fury of the storm. Panic seized her. Those tools, rusted and old as they were all she had: an axe, a saw, a hammer. Without them, she couldn't chop wood for the fire, couldn't make the simplest repairs. She couldn't survive. Without thinking, she plunged into the chaos, her thin shoes sinking into the mud. She began grabbing at the pieces of the roof, the wood slick and heavy, trying to drag them over the opening. It was a fool's errand. The wind was a giant, unseen hand, pushing against her, mocking her efforts. She was soaked to the bone, her teeth chattering, her body shaking with cold and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight. She was so utterly, hopelessly alone. Sinking to her knees in the mud, a raw, guttural sob was torn from her throat, swallowed instantly by the gale. A light cut through the darkness. It was a warm, steady glow, bobbing toward her. She shielded her eyes and saw a figure holding a lantern, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the storm. It was him, the quiet cowboy, Eli. She'd heard the other ranch hand call his name. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look on his face, illuminated by the lantern's glow, was one of grim understanding. He set the lantern down on a stable rock, its light creating a small bubble of safety in the raging dark. He then walked over to the largest piece of the shattered roof, grabbed one end, and motioned with his head for her to take the other. Numbly, she did as he indicated. Together, they wrestled the heavy section of wood, the wind fighting them for every inch. His strength was a quiet, steady force. Where she had struggled and failed, he was a solid anchor. They managed to drag it over the top of the shed, covering most of the opening. He found other pieces, smaller ones, and used them to patch the remaining gaps. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and purposeful. He found rope in the shed and secured the makeshift roof, his knot swift and sure in the dim, flickering light. Clara worked alongside him, her mind blessedly empty, her body moving on instinct. For a few minutes, there was no past, no future. There was only the storm, the lantern light, the slick wood, and the quiet, solid presence of the man beside her. When they were finished, the shed was as secure as it could be. They stood for a moment, the rain still lashing down, their breath pluming in the cold air. Mud caked her dress, and her hands were raw and splintered. She was trembling, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of not being entirely alone in her struggle. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the roar of the wind. She had to break it. The vulnerability of the moment was too much to bear. Her pride, battered and soaked, reared its head. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, her voice small and brittle against the storm. He turned to look at her, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The lantern light caught the tired lines around his blue eyes. He didn't seem offended or surprised. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw not pity, but a quiet acknowledgement of her pain. He bent down, picked up the lantern, and its warm light illuminated his face once more. "Didn't ask for thanks either," he replied, his voice soft, almost lost in the wind. And with that, he turned and walked away, his tall form swallowed by the rain and the darkness, leaving her standing in the mud with the ghost of his words and the steady, golden light of the lantern he had left behind for her. The days that followed fell into a harsh, silent rhythm. The sun would rise, and Clara would rise with it. Her first task to fetch water from the creek, her second to force down a tasteless meal of beans and stale bread. The lantern Eli had left sat on her table, a silent witness. She hadn't lit it again, but she couldn't bring herself to take it outside, either. It was a debt, and she did not know how to repay it, or if she even wanted to. Her main battle was with the woodpile. Silas had left a small stack of logs, but it was dwindling fast, and the Wyoming nights held a deep, biting chill that seeped through the cabin's chinks. She found the axe in the shed Eli had saved, a heavy, rust-pocked thing with a handle that felt foreign and clumsy in her hands. She set a log on the chopping block, took a deep breath, and swung. The axe head glanced off the wood with a jarring thud that vibrated up her arms. She tried again, putting all her frustration and grief into the motion. This time, the blade bit into the wood but stuck fast. She wrestled with it, her face flushed with exertion. On the third swing, her grip was slick with sweat. The axe came down at a bad angle, missing the log almost entirely and slicing across the fleshy part of her left palm. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot up her arm. She cried out, a choked, involuntary sound, and dropped the axe. Blood welled up instantly, a shocking, vibrant red against her pale skin. It ran in rivulets down her wrist, dripping onto the dusty ground. She pressed her other hand against the wound, a wave of dizziness washing over her. It was a stupid, careless mistake, another testament to her own inadequacy. She was not made for this life. She was not made for any life. You'll want to put pressure on that. The quiet voice came from nowhere, and she gasped, spinning around. Eli was standing not 10 feet away, by the fence line. He must have been watching her the whole time. Shame, hot and prickly, flooded her cheeks. He started toward her, his long strides closing the distance between them in seconds. "Stay back," she ordered, her voice trembling. She took a step backward, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest as if protecting it from him. He stopped, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. In one of them, he held a small, folded piece of clean cloth. "It's just a bandage, ma'am. That's a deep cut. It needs wrapping." She stared at him, her mind a war of pride and practical need. The bleeding wasn't slowing. The throbbing in her hand was intensifying. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes holding hers. They were calm, his gaze steady. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like she was a spooked horse that needed a gentle hand. He stopped in front of her and held out the cloth. "Let me see." Wordlessly, her will deserting her, she held out her hand. Her fingers were shaking. He took her wrist gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly warm against her cold skin. He turned her hand over, examining the gash with a practiced eye. "It's clean," he said, his voice a low murmur. "That's good." He carefully unfolded the bandage and wrapped it tightly around her palm, his movements efficient and sure. She watched his hands, the scarred knuckles, the dirt ingrained in the lines of his skin. These were hands that knew work, that knew how to fix what was broken. She kept her eyes fixed on them, resolutely avoiding his face. The simple, physical contact was overwhelming, a spark of warmth in her frozen world. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with kindness. When he was done, he tied the ends in a neat, firm knot. "Keep it clean," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against her wrist before he let go. The touch was electric. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "I have to get back to work," he said, nodding toward the fence. He tipped his hat, a gesture of quiet formality, and turned and walked away without another word. Clara stood there for a long time, her wrapped hand cradled in her good one. She watched him until he was just a tall figure in the distance, his silence as vast as the landscape around them. A new routine began, unspoken and unacknowledged. The next morning, when she opened her door, a small, neat stack of chopped firewood was sitting on her step. It was enough for 2 days. She stared at it, her heart doing a strange, painful flutter. She felt a surge of indignation. Did he think she was helpless? But it was quickly replaced by a wave of weary relief. She carried the wood inside, her cheeks burning. 2 days later, she found a freshly skinned rabbit lying on the same step, a stone weighting down a small bundle of wild herbs beside it. She cooked the rabbit that night, the savory smell filling her small cabin. It was the first decent meal she had eaten in weeks. And as she ate, a single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He never came to the door. He never waited for a word of thanks. The offerings were simply there, silent gifts left at the threshold of her solitude. He was a ghost, a quiet provider who kept his distance, respecting the invisible wall she had built around herself. He seemed to understand that to speak of the kindness would be to shatter it, to force an interaction she was not ready for, and so she let him. She took the wood, the food, the small repairs he made to her shed roof when he thought she wasn't looking. She let him, because a part of her, a part she refused to name, was starving for a gentleness she had thought long dead. But the quiet of the day always gave way to the clamor of the night. The ghosts did their best work in the dark. It was your weakness, Thomas had snarled, his breath sour with whiskey. He had found her by the small, unmarked patch of ground behind their Kansas cabin where she had buried the tiny, blanket-wrapped bundle. She went there every evening, a silent vigil of grief. You wanted it gone, he accused, his voice a venomous whisper. Some part of you is flawed. Clara, a real woman would have held on. A real woman would have given me a son. Each word was a nail driven into her heart. He was rewriting their tragedy, twisting her profound, soul-shattering loss into a deliberate act of failure. He was making her the murderer of her own child. The guilt he planted in her that day took root in the fertile soil of her grief. It grew into a choking vine, wrapping itself around her throat, squeezing the air from her lungs, the hope from her spirit. She began to believe him. The whispers of the town had only confirmed it. Cursed, flawed, barren. She never cried where he could see, but at night, when he was snoring in a drunken stupor beside her, the tears would come. They were silent, hot tears that soaked her pillow, a nightly baptism in shame and sorrow. The guilt choked her still. It was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she could never take off. The preacher's wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in pious disapproval, cornered Eli outside the general store one afternoon. Clara was inside, buying thread, and she watched through the dusty window, her body tense. Mrs. Gable stood with her hands on her hips, her bonnet strings fluttering in the wind as she spoke up at him. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could read the rigid set of the woman's shoulders, the sharp, accusatory jabs of her finger. Eli stood impassively, his hands in his pockets, his head inclined slightly as he listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. His face was an unreadable mask. When Mrs. Gable finally ran out of breath, her chest heaving with self-righteousness, Eli simply looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a single word, he put his hat back on his head, turned, and walked away, leaving her standing there with her mouth agape. He had not defended Clara, but he had not condemned her either. He had simply refused to participate in the town's judgment. He walked his own path. That night, Clara found an extra-large stack of firewood by her door. One sweltering afternoon, the heat was a palpable weight. The air was still and thick with the smell of dust and sage. The creek behind her cabin was the only place that offered a sliver of relief. She went there to soak her feet, sitting on a large, sun-warmed rock, her skirt hiked up to her knees. The cool water was a balm to her spirit. She was about to leave when she heard a splashing sound from further down the creek, around a bend thick with cottonwood trees. Curiosity, an emotion she rarely felt anymore, pricked at her. She rose silently and crept along the bank, her bare feet making no sound on the soft earth. peeking through the leaves. She saw him. Eli was standing waist-deep in the water, his back to her. He had taken off his shirt and was sluicing water over his head and shoulders. The late afternoon sun cut through the trees, dappling his skin with gold. He was lean but powerfully built, his muscles moving smoothly under his skin. And then she saw them. His back was a road map of old pain. Faint, white lines crisscrossed his skin from his shoulders down to his waist. Scars, dozens of them, pale and silvered with age. They were the unmistakable marks of a whip. Clara's breath caught in her throat. A sudden, visceral understanding washed over her. The quiet weariness in his eyes, the stillness he carried like a shield. It was not just from the harshness of the land. He had his own ghosts. He had a past that had marked him. Literally. She stared, unable to look away. A strange and terrible kinship blooming in her chest. Here was a man who knew pain, who knew shame. He turned then, as if sensing her presence, and she saw his profile, the water dripping from his hair and beard. She ducked back behind the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been staring. He would think. She didn't know what he would think. Flushed with an embarrassment so intense it made her dizzy. She turned and fled back to her cabin, her feet stumbling over roots. She slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, her body trembling. The image of his scarred back was burned into her mind. The next day, he came not to her doorstep, but to the edge of her yard, leading a small, gangly creature by a rope. It was a foal, no more than a few months old, its coat the color of dusty buckskin. It was all long, wobbly legs and wide, terrified eyes. It pulled against the rope, dancing nervously. Its nostrils flared. Clara came to her doorway, her arms crossed. "What is that?" Eli didn't look at her directly, his attention on calming the little horse, stroking its neck with a slow, steady hand. "Found her up in the hills. Mama must have been taken by a wolf." He looked up at her then, a faint, almost imperceptible quirk at the corner of his mouth. "She's wild, doesn't trust much of anything. Reminded me of you." The words, blunt and unadorned, should have been an insult, but coming from him, they felt like the most profound observation anyone had ever made about her. He saw her. He saw the wildness, the fear, the distrust. He didn't judge it, he just named it. A sound escaped her throat, a rusty, unfamiliar thing. It was a laugh. It was a bitter, broken sound, full of irony and a deep, aching sadness, but it was a laugh nonetheless. It was the first time she had laughed since before the baby, before Thomas, before everything had fallen to ruin. The sound startled them both. A flicker of surprise crossed Eli's face before he masked it. He tied the foal's rope to her fence post. "She'll need water," was all he said. And then he turned and left. That night, the sky broke open again. A violent thunderstorm crashed down on the plains, the thunder so loud it shook the little cabin to its foundations. Rain hammered on the roof in a deafening torrent. Clara sat by her hearth, the foal's nervous whinnies barely audible over the storm. She felt a kinship with the little creature, both of them alone and frightened of the noise and the dark. Suddenly, over the roar of the wind, she heard a different sound, a heavy thud, followed by a low groan, coming from just outside her door. Every nerve in her body went rigid. Trouble. Trouble always came in the dark. In a storm. She reached for the old rifle Silas had left mounted over the fireplace. Her hands were steady as she checked the load. She crept to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She held the rifle ready, the cold metal a grim comfort, and pulled the door open a crack. A dark shape was crumpled on the ground by her step. For a terrifying second, she thought it was a bear, or a drunk from the saloon who had lost his way. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the scene in a stark, blue-white glare. It was Eli. He was lying on his side in the mud, his face pale, his eyes closed. His horse was nowhere in sight. Forgetting her fear, She threw the door open and rushed to his side, dropping the rifle in the mud. "Eli!" She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over him, unsure where to touch. He groaned again, his eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with pain. "Horse!" he rasped. "Slipped in the mud, threw me!" She saw it then. His left shoulder was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, wet patch was spreading across his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with a fear she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a fear for someone else. "Shoulder," he managed, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went limp. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She couldn't leave him out here in the storm. He would die. She looked at his large frame, then at her own small one. It was impossible, but she had to try. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his, trying to drag him. He was a dead weight, heavy and unresponsive. "Eli, you have to help me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. She pulled again, her feet slipping in the mud, her muscles straining to the point of tearing. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the muddy ground, up the single step, and over the threshold into her cabin. The act felt monumental. She had brought him inside. The wall was breached. She managed to get him close to the hearth, his wet clothes soaking the floorboards. She built up the fire until it blazed, casting a warm, flickering light over his pale face. His breathing was shallow. She had to see the wound. Her hands trembled as she reached for the buttons of his wet, muddy shirt. This felt like a greater violation than bringing him inside. She fumbled with the buttons, her fingers clumsy with haste and a strange, unnerving intimacy. She pulled the wet fabric apart. His chest was broad and dusted with dark hair, rising and falling with each shallow breath. She peeled the shirt off his injured shoulder. The wound was ugly. His shoulder was clearly dislocated, the bone forming a painful-looking lump under the skin, and there was a deep gash on his upper arm, torn by a rock or a sharp branch, bleeding sluggishly. She worked on instinct, the part of her that was a woman, a healer, taking over. She fetched her water basin and the last of her clean cloths. She gently washed the mud and blood from the wound. He stirred, groaning in his unconsciousness. The tension in the small room was unbearable. It was the silence, the flickering firelight, the sound of the rain, and the shocking, raw intimacy of tending to this man's body. She had only ever known a man's touch as something to be feared or endured. This was different. This was a fragile trust, born of necessity and a storm. She found a bottle of whiskey in Silas's old trunk and used it to clean the gash. He flinched, but didn't wake. She bandaged the wound tightly with strips torn from one of her petticoats. The dislocation was beyond her skill. It would have to wait. All she could do now was keep him warm and wait for the storm to pass. She dragged the thin mattress from her cot and put it on the floor by the hearth, rolling him onto it as gently as she could. She covered him with her only blanket, exhausted. She sank into the lone chair, watching him. The firelight played over the sharp angles of his face, softening the weary lines. In sleep, he looked younger, more vulnerable. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the relative quiet, she could hear the ticking of her own heart. He was here, in her cabin, in her space, a man, but not just any man. A quiet man with sad eyes and a scarred back, a man who brought her firewood and wild foals, a man who had faced down the town's judgment for her without a word. She stood up and walked over to him, kneeling by his side. The firelight flickered in his hair. She reached out, her hand hesitating in the air above his face. She shouldn't. She should keep her distance. He was a danger to her solitude, to the fragile peace she had fought so hard to build. She whispered the words into the quiet room, a prayer to the walls that had been her only confidants. "Don't stay long." But her body betrayed her. Her hand lowered, her fingers gently, so gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her touch lingered on the surprising softness of his skin. a warm, living presence in her cold, empty world. She stayed like that for a long moment, her hand resting on his cheek, a silent confession in the dead of night. The first thing Clara noticed when she awoke was the silence, the rhythmic sound of a sleeping man's breath. A sound that had been a constant source of dread for years was gone. She sat up with a start, her heart thumping. The mattress she had given him was empty, the blanket folded neatly at its foot. By the door, his boots were gone. He had left. A strange, hollow feeling settled in her chest. It was not relief. It was a keen, sharp-edged disappointment that she refused to name. She had whispered for him not to stay, and he had listened. She should be grateful. Her sanctuary was her own again. But the cabin, which had felt like a fortress just days before, now felt profoundly empty. The air was still thick with the faint scent of rain-soaked wool and him. She spent the day in a haze of restless energy, her thoughts circling back to the night before, his weight in her cabin, the feel of his skin under her hands, the quiet vulnerability of his sleeping face. She fed the little foal, its skittish movements a reflection of her own jumpy nerves. She tried to work in her small, sad garden, but her hands felt clumsy, her mind distant, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long shadows from the mountains. She saw him. He was riding toward his own small line cabin a mile or so down the creek, his silhouette dark against the fiery sunset. As he passed the edge of her property, he stopped. He looked toward her cabin, and she knew he could see her standing in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't wave. He simply lifted his hand to the brim of his hat, a slow, deliberate tip of acknowledgement. Then he rode on. The gesture was a question and an answer all in one. "I am still here. I will not intrude, but I am not gone." Clara's breath escaped her in a long, shaky sigh. She watched until he disappeared, her hand pressed against the rough wood of the doorframe. The next day, she needed supplies. Her flour sack was nearly empty, and she needed salt to preserve the last of the rabbit meat. The trip to the general store was a journey she dreaded, a necessary walk into the heart of her own exile. As she stepped inside, the familiar chill descended. The low hum of conversation among the three women gathered by the counter, including the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, ceased the moment they saw her. It was as if she had brought a winter wind in with her. Clara kept her chin high, her back ramrod straight. She walked directly to the barrels at the back of the store, refusing to acknowledge their silent condemnation. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the rustle of their dresses as they leaned their heads together to whisper. The air grew thick with their judgment. "Buying for two now, is she?" one of them murmured, the words just loud enough to carry. Shameful. Taking in a man like that, a decent man, too. That was Mrs. Gable, her voice dripping with venomous pity. Clara's hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of her skirt. Her face felt hot, her ears ringing. She scooped her flour with methodical, jerky movements, her gaze fixed on the task. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not let them see her crumble. She paid the storekeeper, her coins clinking loudly in the oppressive silence, and turned to leave. She walked past the three women, her eyes looking straight through them as if they were nothing more than sacks of grain. She made it all the way back to her property line before the facade broke. As soon as the cabin was in sight, the rigid control she held over herself shattered. Her steps faltered, and she stumbled behind the relative privacy of the dilapidated shed. Leaning against the rough, sun-bleached wood, she slid to the ground, the sack of flour forgotten beside her. A dry, racking sob escaped her throat. Then another. The tears she had refused to shed in front of them came in a hot, silent flood, carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Their words were a poison she had been drinking for years. Shameful, cursed, flawed. Thomas had said them. The women in Kansas had whispered them. And now these women, Strangers who knew nothing of her echoed them. The shame was a physical thing, a heavy stone in her belly, a tightness in her throat that made it hard to breathe. She didn't know how long she sat there, curled into a small, miserable ball of grief. She didn't hear him approach. She only knew he was there when a shadow fell over her. From a distance, working on the fence, Eli had seen her come back from town. He had seen her straight, proud back, and he had seen the moment it broke. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears. Eli stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands. His face was unreadable, his eyes holding a deep, quiet sorrow that seemed to echo her own. He didn't speak. He didn't rush forward to offer clumsy words of comfort that would have felt like lies. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, his presence a silent anchor in her storm of shame. He watched, not with pity, but with a profound, unwavering witness. He saw her at her lowest, most broken moment, and he did not turn away. The next morning, she was woken by a rhythmic tapping sound. She peered out her window and saw Eli on her porch. He had a stack of fresh lumber beside him and a hammer in his hand. He was prying up one of the rotten, treacherous floorboards. She watched, bewildered, as he worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He replaced the rotten plank with a new one. His hammer blows firm and even. He worked for hours, never once looking to see if she was watching. He replaced 3 more boards, secured a loose railing, and reinforced the steps that had groaned under her weight for weeks. He was not just fixing her porch. He was mending the threshold to her world. He was building something solid and dependable in a place where everything else was falling apart. It was his answer to her tears. He couldn't silence the whispers of the town, but he could silence the groan of a rotten floorboard. He couldn't erase her pain, but he could give her a safe place to stand. One afternoon, the heat was suffocating. The air was thick and still, the sun a merciless white eye in a bleached-out sky. The oppression in the air mirrored the suffocating weight in Clara's own soul. The memories of Thomas, of the baby, of the town's scorn, all rose up and coalesced into a wave of despair so powerful it threatened to drown her. She fled to the barn, the new name she gave the repaired shed. It was dark and smelled of hay and dry earth. She sank onto an old crate in the corner, and the sobs she had been holding back for days finally broke free. This was not the silent, shameful weeping of the day before. This was a raw, animal sound of pure agony. It was a lament for her lost child, for her lost self, for the years of fear and loneliness that had hollowed her out. She buried her face in her hands and wept until her body ached. She felt a presence before she saw him. The light from the doorway was partially blocked. Eli was standing there, his large frame filling the entrance. He had a bucket of water for the foal in one hand. He stopped when he saw her, his face softening with a look of deep concern. He didn't leave. He set the bucket down and walked slowly into the barn. The air was thick with her grief. He said nothing. He simply pulled over another crate and sat down a few feet away from her, his back against the rough wood wall. He rested his forearms on his knees and waited. He just sat. He didn't try to soothe her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply shared the space with her, his quiet, steady presence, a testament to a patience she had never known. He sat with her through the shuddering gasps, through the long, ragged breaths that followed. He let her sorrow fill the space between them, and he was not afraid of it. He let her be broken, and he did not try to gather the pieces. When the last of the tears were spent, she was left limp and exhausted, a hollowed-out quiet in her soul. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. "You can't fix me." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a warning, a plea. Eli was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the dusty floor. He reached up and slowly took off his hat, holding it in his hands as he turned it over and over. When he finally looked at her, His blue eyes were clear and direct, holding a truth that struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Didn't come to fix," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just came to stay." He set his hat down on the floor beside him. A simple, definitive gesture. It was not a promise. It was a statement of intent. He was staying. In that moment, Clara felt something shift inside her. A tiny, fragile seed of trust beginning to push its way through the barren ground of her heart. That night, they sat on the newly repaired porch as the sun went down. The wild foal grazed nearby, calmer now, more accustomed to her presence. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer empty or awkward. It was full, a comfortable space woven from shared understanding. The air cooled, and a million stars began to prick the vast, dark canopy of the sky. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the faint starlight. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently run his thumb over the new wood of the porch railing he had fixed. Then he looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. She didn't turn away. She didn't flinch. She simply waited. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. His lips met hers with a softness, a hesitation that spoke of a deep respect. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but of quiet inquiry. It was tentative, gentle, and it tasted of dust and loneliness and a startling, unfamiliar tenderness. Her own lips were stiff, unpracticed. For a second, she allowed herself to feel it, the simple warmth of another human being. Then the fear, the old, familiar panic, surged up. She pulled back, her breath catching in her throat. She looked away, toward the dark outline of the mountains, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for him to press, to demand, to turn angry. Thomas always had. But Eli just sat there. When she finally dared to look at him again, he was watching her, his expression patient. He made no move to touch her again. He didn't leave, and she, in the echoing silence of her own fear, did not ask him to. The next day, the whispers in town became a roar. Someone had seen them on the porch. The story twisted and grew with each telling, fueled by Mrs. Gable's righteous indignation. The cursed widow had sunk her claws into a good man. She was a siren, a temptress, dragging him down into her own pit of sin and sorrow. Eli heard the talk when he went to the saloon for a beer after a long day's work. A rancher named Jed, a big man with a mean streak and a loud mouth, was holding court at the bar. "Can't say I blame him," Jed bellowed, winking at the other men. "A lonely widow like that, probably grateful for any man who'll have her. Wonder what she's like in the hay." The men laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. Eli, who had been standing quietly in the corner, set his beer down on the table. He walked over to the bar, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's enough, Jed," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Jed turned, a sneer on his face. "What's it to you, Eli? You tasting the widow's wares?" Eli's jaw tightened. "The lady's name is Mrs. Thompson, and you'll not speak it again." Jed laughed and shoved Eli's shoulder. "Or what?" Eli didn't answer with words. His fist shot out, a swift, hard blow that caught Jed square on the jaw. The bigger man staggered back, surprise and rage warring on his face. Then all hell broke loose. It was a brutal, ugly saloon brawl, all flailing fists and crashing furniture. Eli was outnumbered, but he fought with a cold, desperate fury, a lifetime of pent-up pain behind every blow. He came to her door an hour later. A cut was open over his eye, his lip was split and bleeding, and his knuckles were raw and bruised. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. Clara gasped when she saw him. She pulled him inside without a word, her heart aching with a fierce, protective anger she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. She pushed him gently into the chair and went to fetch the water basin and cloths. This time, as she tended to him, there was no hesitation. She cleaned the gash over his eye in silence, her touch gentle but firm. He winced when she dabbed at the cut, but he didn't pull away. He just watched her, his gaze intense. When she finished with his eye, she moved to his mouth. "They were talking about me," she said. It wasn't a question.
"Doesn't matter what they say,"
he rasped, his voice rough. "It matters if you get hurt for it." She leaned closer, dabbing the cloth at the corner of his swollen lip. Her hair brushed his cheek. His breath was warm on her skin. The space between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do with the night before. His good hand came up and rested on her waist, his touch a steady, grounding pressure. She paused, the cloth held just above his lip. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of whiskey and sweat and blood. He was real, he was solid. He had fought for her. He leaned his head forward, closing the small distance between them. He kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the first. It was deep and hungry, a raw claiming. It was the release of a day's worth of violence and a lifetime of loneliness. She gasped against his mouth, and he took the sound as an invitation, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. She dropped the cloth, her hands coming to rest on his bruised shoulders. This time, she didn't pull away. She kissed him back. He stood, pulling her with him, his mouth never leaving hers. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her the few steps to the cot. He laid her down gently, his body covering hers, his weight a welcome burden. They were both trembling, their breath coming in ragged gasps. This was a territory she knew only as a place of pain, duty, and fear. But with Eli, it was different. His hands were not demanding, his eyes were not cruel. They were full of a desperate, gentle need that mirrored her own. As their bodies joined, a sob broke from her throat. Then another. The tears came, hot and unstoppable, soaking the pillow beneath her head. It was the final, shattering release of all the shame, all the grief, all the pain that had been locked inside her for so long. She was weeping for her lost baby, for her broken marriage, for the woman she had once been. Through it all, Eli's movements were slow, his rhythm steady. He held her, his arms wrapped around her, his lips pressed against her temple. He didn't speak. He didn't ask her why she was crying. He simply held her, accepting her tears, her pain, her brokenness, and stayed. In the cold, unforgiving light of morning, shame was a physical presence in the cabin. It was a sour taste in Clara's mouth, a cold film on her skin. She looked at the indentation on the mattress where Eli had slept beside her, the rumpled blanket, and felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made her stomach churn. Her tears the night before had not been a release. They had been a confession of her own ruin. She had let him see the ugliest, most broken parts of her soul, and in doing so, she felt she had given him the power to destroy her completely. The voice in her head was Thomas's, sneering and cruel. "See, you're nothing but a damaged thing, good for one purpose, and you can't even do that without weeping like a child." She scrubbed at her skin in the basin of cold water, trying to wash away the feel of Eli's hands, the memory of his body next to hers, but the scent of him lingered on the blanket, a phantom presence that both accused and comforted, a contradiction that tore at her fragile composure. She had allowed a breach in her defenses, and the only solution she could fathom was to run. She would pack her single bag, take what little money she had, and walk until she reached the next town, and then the next. She would disappear into the vast, indifferent landscape, become a ghost before she was even dead. The thought was terrifying, but the thought of facing Eli again was worse. What would she see in his eyes? Pity, disgust, or, most terrifying of all, a tenderness she felt she had no right to accept. For 3 days, she lived like a hermit, a prisoner in her own cabin. She only ventured out at dawn to fetch water and feed the foal, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of him. She saw him once, a distant figure mending a fence line far to the south. Her heart seized in her chest, and she fled back inside, bolting the door as if he were an intruder. He did not approach the cabin. He did not knock on her door, but his presence remained. On the second day, she found a small pot of soup on her porch step, still warm, a piece of flatbread wrapped in a cloth beside it. It smelled of venison and wild carrots. She stared at it, her throat tight. It was an offering of peace, an act of quiet patience that was more unnerving than any demand would have been. She left it there, a stubborn monument to her own fear. By evening, she was so hungry she could not stand it. She brought the pot inside, her hands shaking, and ate the soup cold, in the dark. It felt like a surrender. He said nothing about the distance she had placed between them. He did not mention the soup. He simply waited, his silence a steady, unnerving pressure. He was giving her space to run, yet his quiet persistence made it impossible to flee. He was a mountain, and she was just a wind, blowing uselessly against him. The shame she felt was an old, familiar friend, a cloak she had worn for years. It transported her back to the darkest day of her life, a memory that played itself over and over in the quiet, lonely nights. The Kansas cabin had been an oven, the air thick with the oppressive heat of a plain summer. The buzz of flies was a constant, maddening drone. Clara lay on the sweat-soaked mattress, her body a vessel of ceaseless, rhythmic pain. The cramps had started that morning, and with each new wave, a knot of terror tightened in her chest. This was not right. It was too soon. The midwife was in the next county, a day's ride away, delivering another woman's child. Thomas was gone. Of course, he was at the saloon, his laughter carrying on the hot, still air, a sound that mocked her solitary agony. She had called for him, her voice a weak, pathetic cry, but he had waved a dismissive hand and told her she was being hysterical. Women do this all the time, he'd slurred, his breath already sour with morning whiskey. So she was alone. The hours blurred into a red haze of pain. She bit down on a strip of leather until her jaw ached, her knuckles white as she gripped the stained sheets. She prayed, not to God, but to the child inside her, begging it to hold on, to be strong. But the tide of her own body was against her. The final, wrenching spasm felt as if it were tearing her in two. And then there was a terrible, unnatural stillness. The pain receded, leaving behind an emptiness so vast and profound it was a death of its own. She lay there for hours, adrift in a sea of grief, the metallic scent of blood thick in the air. When Thomas finally stumbled home, well after dark, he found her staring at the ceiling, her eyes vacant. He looked at the blood, at her pale, lifeless face, and his drunken sorrow curdled into a familiar, ugly rage. He did not hold her. He did not comfort her. He stood in the doorway and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger. "This is your doing," he'd said, his voice cracking. "You've killed my son." And in the echoing silence of that dusty, fly-blown cabin, Clara had believed him. She was alone in her pain, alone in her grief, and now alone in her guilt. No one came to help. No one had even known to try. On the fourth day, necessity forced her out of her self-imposed exile. She needed kerosene for her lamp and more bandages for her hand, which was beginning to heal. She made her way to the makeshift market that sprang up near the livery on Wednesdays. Farmers sold produce from the back of their wagons, and a trapper had laid out a collection of furs. It was a small, bustling hub of activity, a place she normally avoided at all costs. She moved through the small crowd, keeping her head down, her shawl pulled tight. As she passed behind a wagon loaded with sacks of potatoes, she heard a voice she recognized. Jed, the loud-mouthed rancher Eli had fought. He was talking to another man, a land speculator from Cheyenne with a fancy waistcoat and greedy eyes.
It's the water, see?
Jed was saying, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "That creek of his. It's the only one that don't run dry in August. He won't sell. Stubborn fool. Thinks that sorry little plot of land is worth something." "Everything's worth something to the right buyer," the speculator said smoothly. "Or to the man who can take it." Jed chuckled, a nasty sound. "That's why I'm talking to you, Mr. Bartholomew, the big rancher south of here. He's authorized me to offer a bounty, $200 to any man, or group of men, who can persuade Eli to move on, persuade him permanent-like, if you catch my meaning." Clara froze, her blood running cold. $200. In a town like Redemption, that was a fortune. It was enough to make desperate men do terrible things. They were talking about driving Eli off his land. Or worse, they were going to kill him over a trickle of water in a dusty creek bed. Forgetting her own shame, her own fear, a new, fiercer emotion took hold. A cold, protective fury. She bought her kerosene and fled the market, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't go back to her cabin. She turned down the path that led to his. She found him by his corral, tightening a loose rail. He looked up when he heard her approach, his face carefully neutral, but a flicker of surprise showed in his eyes. His own bruises from the fight had faded to ugly, yellowish splotches. "They're going to come for you," she said, her voice breathless, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I heard them in town. A man named Bartholomew. He's put a bounty on your land, $200. They want the water rights. They'll kill you for it. Eli—" He stopped his work, leaning against the fence rail. He listened to her frantic words, his expression unchanging. He didn't seem surprised or scared. He just looked tired. "You have to leave," she pleaded, stepping closer. "It's not worth it. It's just dirt. You can find other land, another place." He looked out over the small valley, his gaze taking in the simple log cabin, the corral, the small herd of cattle grazing by the creek. "It's not just dirt, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's roots. A man gets tired of drifting. A man needs a place to put down roots." He turned his gaze back to her, and his blue eyes were piercing. "Not everything has to be run from—" The words struck her like a slap. He was talking about more than the land. He was talking about her instinct to flee, her constant, desperate retreat from anything that might cause her pain. The injustice of it, the quiet accusation in his voice, ignited her fear into rage. "Roots!" she cried, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "What good are roots in a graveyard? They will put you in the ground. Eli, for what? For pride? For a piece of dirt that doesn't care if you live or die?" "I ain't dying," he said calmly. "You will!" she screamed, her control finally snapping. "Just like Thomas did, drunk on pride, picking a fight he couldn't win in a saloon over nothing, and I was the one left to clean up the mess. I was the one left with the whispers and the shame. I will not do that again. I will not watch another man throw his life away for nothing." She was shaking, the force of her own fury terrifying her. She had come to warn him, to save him, and he was standing there, as stubborn and unmovable as the mountains themselves. She took a step toward him and did something she had never done in her life. She struck him, her open palm slapped against his chest, a pathetic, harmless blow. Then she did it again, her fists balling up, pounding against the solid wall of his body. "Don't you do this!" she screamed, each word punctuated by a blow. "Don't you dare make me care about you and then leave me! Don't you dare!" She was screaming and crying and hitting him, a frantic percussion of despair against his unyielding frame. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand to stop her. He just stood there and took it, his face a mask of sorrow. When her frantic energy was finally spent, when her arms grew heavy and her sobs choked her, he wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her against his chest and just held her, his large hands stroking her hair. She struggled for a moment, a last, weak protest, but he held firm. She sagged against him, her fight gone, and wept into the rough fabric of his shirt. He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out, until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind and the heavy beating of his heart beneath her ear. That night, a raw, desperate need pulsed between them. The argument had torn down the last of their walls, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Back in her cabin, the air was thick with unspoken words, with the violent clash of her fear and his resolve. He reached for her, and she did not pull away. Their coming together was not the gentle exploration of their first time, nor was it the tender healing of the second. It was a storm. It was rough and desperate, a feverish, frantic clinging. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the metallic tang of blood from where she bit her lip. It was a battle against the loneliness that haunted them both, a furious, temporary truce with the ghosts of their pasts. Her nails, which she had kept trimmed for practical work, raked down the scarred landscape of his back, not in anger, but in a desperate attempt to hold on, to leave a mark on him that proved this was real. He buried his face in her neck, his body a heavy, grounding weight that kept her from flying apart. When she cried out his name, her voice broke, the sound a raw mixture of pleasure and pain, a sound of complete and utter surrender. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, the sound of their ragged breathing filling the small cabin. The storm had passed, leaving a strange, fragile peace in its wake. The silence stretched, no longer a weapon or a shield, but a space to be filled with truth. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery lines of his scars. Each one was a question she knew she would never ask. She thought of her own scars, the ones on the inside that no one could see. "I don't know how to love without pain," she confessed, the words a raw whisper in the darkness. It was the truest thing she had ever said, the core of her own brokenness laid bare. She felt the rumble of his sigh beneath her ear. His hand came up to stroke her hair, his touch infinitely gentle. He pressed his lips to her temple, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, steady promise in the dark. "Then we'll learn slow." The promise to learn slow was a fragile truce, a whispered hope in the dead of night. But the world outside the cabin had no patience for slow things. The tension in redemption, which had been a low, simmering heat, began to boil over. It started not with a bang, but with the quiet snip of wire. Eli rode out one morning to find a long section of his fence cut, his small herd of cattle scattered across the open range. It took him 2 days of hard riding under a relentless sun to round them all up. Clara watched him from her porch, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. This was the beginning. She knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. She made a stew that evening, thick with rabbit and the last of her garden vegetables, and brought it to his cabin. She found him exhausted, his face grim, his hands raw from repairing the wire. He ate in silence, but his eyes thanked her. A week later, the sabotage escalated from nuisance to cruelty. Eli found 2 of his best heifers down by the creek, their bodies bloated and stiff, white foam crusting their mouths. The water downstream from his property had been poisoned. The metallic, chemical smell hung heavy and sweet in the air, a scent of deliberate malice. Clara stood beside him, looking at the dead animals, at the waste and the hatred behind the act. She saw the muscle in Eli's jaw jump, a flicker of the cold fury he kept so tightly leashed. This was not just about land anymore. It was a war of attrition, designed to break his spirit. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her small table, turning a small, velvet-lined box over and over in her hands. Inside lay the only things of value she had left from her old life, a pair of pearl earrings and a thin gold locket her mother had given her. They were ghosts of a life that had never really been hers, symbols of a gentility that had been a lie. The next morning, she went to him. He was digging a deep pit to bury the dead cattle, his movements stiff with anger and sorrow. "I want you to take these," she said, holding out the box. "Sell them in Cheyenne. It's not much, but it might be enough to buy more cattle, or to—" She trailed off, not wanting to say the words, "or to leave." He stopped digging, leaning on his shovel. He looked at the jewelry box, then at her face. He reached out and gently closed her fingers over the box. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "But you need—" "What I need isn't in that box," he said, his gaze unwavering. "This is my fight. Clara, I won't be run off, and I won't sell a memory to pay for it." He respected her sacrifice, but he would not accept it. To do so would be to admit that the fight could be measured in dollars, and for him, it was a matter of the soul. He turned back to his grim work. The conversation over, she was left standing there, her offer of help, her sacrifice, rejected. She felt both frustrated and, in a strange way, proud of his unbending will. The following Sunday, the conflict moved from the pastures into the house of God. The small, clapboard church was the town's social and moral center, presided over by Reverend Gable, a man whose piety was matched only by his lack of compassion. Clara had not set foot in a church since Thomas's funeral, but a stubborn, defiant impulse moved her that morning. She would not hide. She would not let their judgment make her a prisoner. She slipped into a pew at the very back just as the sermon was beginning. The air was stuffy, thick with the scent of pine polish and hypocrisy. She could feel the stares, the sudden stiffening of backs, the rustle of dresses as women leaned to whisper to their neighbors. Mrs. Gable, sitting in the front row like a queen on her throne, turned and shot her a look of pure venom. Reverend Gable mounted the pulpit, his face flushed with righteous fire. He opened his Bible, but his eyes were fixed on the back of the church, on her. His sermon was not about forgiveness or grace. It was about sin.
"And I say to you, beware the strange woman," he boomed,
his voice echoing in the rafters.
"Beware the woman whose path leads to ruin, whose feet go down to death.
She is the snare, the net, the serpent in the garden. She brings scandal and strife. She is the fallen woman who tempts good men from the path of righteousness and into the pit of despair." Every word was a stone thrown directly at her. The congregation shifted, their faces a mixture of pious agreement and prurient curiosity. They were all looking at her. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar, choking shame threatening to suffocate her. The old instinct screamed at her to flee, to run from this place and never look back. But then she thought of Eli, of his quiet strength, of his scars, of his promise to learn slow. She thought of him fighting for her name in a saloon. He had not flinched from a brawl. She would not flinch from a sermon. She lifted her chin, her back straightening. She met the preacher's fiery gaze and held it. She would not look away. She would not let him break her. Her stare was a silent act of rebellion, a declaration that she was still here, still breathing, and she would not be defined by his hatred. The heavy church door creaked open. Every head turned. Eli stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. He was not dressed for church. He wore his dusty work clothes, his hat held in his hands. He took in the scene in an instant, the preacher in the pulpit, the gawking congregation, and Clara, alone in the back pew, a defiant statue in a sea of judgment. He walked down the central aisle, his boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the wooden floorboards. The preacher faltered, his sermon dying on his lips. Eli did not look at him. He did not look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed on Clara. He walked all the way to her pew and stood before her. Then, in the echoing silence of God's own house, he reached down and took her hand. His hand was warm and calloused, a solid, living anchor in that cold, hateful room. He didn't pull her out. He simply slipped into the pew beside her, his large frame a solid wall between her and the rest of the world. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of hers, and turned his calm, unreadable gaze toward the sputtering preacher. The message was clear. Where she is, I am. Her fight is my fight. Condemn her, and you condemn me. The preacher, flustered and red-faced, stumbled through the rest of his sermon. The fire was gone from his voice. A quiet cowboy had doused it with a single, silent act of loyalty. That night, an unsettling quiet fell over the cabin. The public declaration in the church had changed something, solidifying the bond between them but also drawing the battle lines more clearly. While tidying the few belongings Silas had left in a dusty trunk, Clara's fingers brushed against a small, flat object tucked into a side pocket. It was a letter. The envelope was yellowed and addressed to her in Thomas's familiar, messy scrawl. The postmark was from the town where he had died, dated the day before the saloon fight. She had received it in a bundle of his effects a week after his death and, in her numb grief and anger, had shoved it away. Unread. She had not wanted to hear his excuses, his blame, his venom, from beyond the grave. Now! She held it in her hands, this ghost from a life that felt a century old. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky. Clara, I am writing this from the saloon. I have been drinking. I know that is no surprise. I have been thinking about the boy. Our boy. It was my fault. I see that now. I was a coward. I was afraid. And I made you carry my fear. I broke something in you. I know I did. I do not know how to fix it. I do not know how to fix myself. I am going to play cards now. Maybe my luck will turn. Forgive me. Thomas. She read it twice, then a third time. The words were not the absolution she had never sought, nor the final condemnation she had expected. They were simply pathetic. The confession of a weak, broken man, steeped in whiskey and self-pity. There was no grand apology, just a sad, tired admission of his own failure. For years, his words had been the chains around her heart, his blame the poison in her soul. But this letter, this final, flimsy message, held no power. It was just the last whimper of a man she had ceased to love long before he died. He had not been a monster. He had just been a small man, and she had let his smallness define her world. She walked to the hearth, where a low fire still burned. She looked at the letter one last time, at the name of the son they never had, and, for the first time, she felt not guilt, but a profound, cleansing sorrow. She had mourned a man who blamed her, but the man who wrote this letter was a stranger. She held the corner of the paper to the flame. It caught, the edges curling and turning black. The ink of Thomas's name vanished in a brief, orange flare. She watched until the last of it turned to a fragile, gray ash, which collapsed in on itself and was gone. A weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying lifted from her shoulders. She was free. The ranch war broke out 3 nights later. The attack came without warning, a furious assault under the cover of a moonless sky. Clara was woken by a frantic whinnying from the foal, followed by the sound of splintering wood and the guttural shouts of men. Then she saw it, a flicker of orange light against her window, growing brighter with terrifying speed. She threw open her door and saw a scene from hell. 3 men on horseback were riding near Eli's barn, their faces hidden by bandanas. One of them held a torch. The small barn, which housed Eli's 2 horses and a winter's supply of hay, was already engulfed in flames. The fire roared, a living, devouring beast, spewing black smoke and embers into the night sky. Eli burst from his cabin, a rifle in his hand. He fired a shot into the air, and the riders, their work done, spurred their horses and galloped off into the darkness. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the 2 largest buckets she owned and ran, not away from the fire, but toward it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it was a drumbeat of purpose, not fear.
The horses!
Eli yelled, his face stark and desperate in the firelight as he ran toward the burning barn.
No, Eli, it's too late,
she screamed, but he ignored her. disappearing into the inferno. She worked with a frantic energy she didn't know she possessed. She ran to the creek, filled the heavy buckets, the water sloshing over the sides, and ran back, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She threw the water on the side of his cabin, which was starting to smolder from the intense heat. She ran back and forth, a ceaseless, desperate circuit. The heat was a physical blow, blistering her skin. Embers rained down, singeing her hair and her dress. Her hands, raw and clumsy, were quickly covered in blisters. Eli stumbled out of the barn, coughing, his face black with soot, dragging a half-conscious horse behind him. He had gotten one out. He tied it far from the fire and then grabbed 2 more buckets, joining her in the desperate, hopeless fight. They were not trying to save the barn anymore. They were trying to save his cabin, his home, his roots. They worked side by side, a silent, soot-stained team, their movements synchronized by the desperate rhythm of survival. They hauled water until their arms felt like they would tear from their sockets, until their lungs were full of smoke and their eyes streamed with tears. Finally, as the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, they saw that the cabin was safe. The fire, having consumed its fuel, began to die down. They stood in the ruinous glow, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The barn was a skeletal ruin, a black, smoking wound on the land. In the devastating silence that followed the roar, Eli turned to her. He reached out and gently brushed a piece of ash from her cheek. His eyes, in his soot-blackened face, were clear and full of a raw, aching emotion she had never seen before. "You're the fiercest woman I've known," he said, his voice a rough, smoke-scoured whisper. She looked up at him, at this quiet, stubborn man who had walked into a fire for his horse, who had walked into a church for her. The words came from a place deep inside her, a truth she had only just discovered. "And you're the first man I didn't fear," she replied. They were too exhausted to go back to their separate cabins. They stumbled into the half-burned, soot-stained ruin of the barn, the parts that were still standing. The ground was warm. They collapsed onto a pile of hay that had been spared the flames, their bodies aching. He pulled her against him, and she went willingly, curling into his side, her head on his shoulder. The smell of smoke was in their hair, on their skin, in their lungs. She lay there, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound of life in the midst of destruction. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake, alone and terrified. She thought of the emptiness, the silence, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was done with it. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered into the darkness. He tightened his arm around her, his own silent agreement. After a long moment, she shifted, turning to face him in the near-total darkness. She reached for him, her blistered hands surprisingly steady. She found the buckle of his belt, her fingers working it loose. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, an unspoken question. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. "No promises," she whispered, her voice husky with soot and a desire that was deeper than passion. It was a need for connection, for life, for a warmth to hold back the cold. "Just stay tonight." He stayed. The ash from the barn fire seemed to settle into the very soil, a gray memory of the violence that had visited them. But from that ash, something new and quiet began to grow. They did not speak of the fire, nor of the night they had spent wrapped in each other's arms in the smoky ruin. Instead, they spoke with their hands, with the shared weight of labor. They began to build a new fence. The work was hard, a silent conversation held under the vast, indifferent sky. Eli showed Clara how to dig a proper post hole, how to tamp the earth down so it would hold firm against the wind. He taught her how to stretch the wire taut, the metallic twang of it a new kind of music on the quiet plains. Her hands, already calloused from chopping wood, grew tougher, the blisters healing into a second skin. He would watch her, a faint, proud quirk to his lips. as she mastered a task that had once seemed impossible. The sweat ran in rivulets down their backs. The sun beat down, turning their skin the color of the earth they worked. But in the midst of this quiet, sweaty toil, something softened. One afternoon, as she struggled to hold a heavy post steady, her foot slipped, and she stumbled, letting the post fall with a thud. She looked up, expecting his quiet patience, but instead, she saw his shoulders shaking. He was laughing, a low, rumbling sound she had never heard before, and seeing him, a real, genuine laugh that reached his tired eyes, she felt her own lips curve upwards, a real smile, not the bitter twist of irony she was used to, but a smile that came from a place of lightness she had forgotten existed. They didn't speak of it, but after that, the smiles came more often. A shared look over a perfectly stretched wire, a moment of rest, passing a canteen of water back and forth, their fingers brushing. They were building more than a fence. They were building a life, one post at a time. Autumn bled into the gray stillness of early winter. The days grew short, the wind sharp with the promise of snow. The town of Redemption settled into a state of watchful waiting. The attack on Eli's barn had been a message, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Bartholomew and his men were waiting for winter to do their work for them, to freeze Eli out. But they hadn't counted on Clara. She had spent the autumn harvesting every wild root and berry, canning and preserving, turning her small, broken-down cabin into a fortress of sustenance. They would not starve. They would not freeze. They would endure. The first big snow came just after Thanksgiving, a blizzard that descended from the mountains without warning. It was a white monster, erasing the world, burying the plains under a thick, silent blanket. For 3 days, the wind howled, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the doors and windows. Clara and Eli were snowed in, each in their own cabin, but the distance between them felt different now. It was not a gulf of fear, but a simple fact of the weather. On the third night of the storm, a frantic, muffled pounding came at Clara's door. She opened it to a wall of white and a figure crusted in snow. It was John Miller, a neighbor from a mile down the creek, his face wild with panic. His wife, Mary, was one of the women who had whispered about Clara in the general store. "It's Mary," he gasped, his breath coming in white plumes. "The baby. It's coming now. The midwife's in the next county, and the road's impassable. I went for Eli, but we don't know what to do." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through Clara. A baby. A birth. The world seemed to tilt, the howling of the wind turning into the echo of her own past screams. She saw the dusty Kansas cabin, felt the tearing pain, the terrible, final emptiness. Her first instinct was to slam the door, to retreat into the safety of her own grief. But then she saw the raw terror in John Miller's eyes, the same helpless fear that must have been on her own face all those years ago. And she thought of Mary, alone and frightened in that small cabin. No one had come for her. She would not let another woman suffer that same fate. "I'll come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She pulled on her thickest shawl and boots, grabbed a bundle of clean cloths, and followed John out into the blinding storm, with Eli a steadying presence at her side. The Miller cabin was a small, tense bubble of fear against the raging blizzard. Mary was in her bed, her face pale with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the sheets. She looked at Clara, and her eyes, wide with pain, filled with a new kind of fear. She was seeing the cursed widow, the barren woman, a harbinger of death in her birthing room. Clara's heart ached with a terrible empathy. She walked to the bedside, her movements calm and deliberate. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I am here to help you. Mary, you are not alone." The hours that followed were a trial by fire and ice. The storm raged outside, while a different kind of storm raged within the small cabin. John Miller paced uselessly, wringing his hands. Eli kept the fire roaring and a pot of water boiling. His quiet, solid presence, a silent anchor in the room. Clara was the center of it all. The ghost of her own loss was a constant presence, whispering its litany of failure in her ear. But for every whisper of the past, she focused on the woman before her, on the life that was fighting its way into the world. She bathed Mary's forehead with cool cloths. She spoke to her in low, soothing tones, telling her when to breathe, when to push. She held her hand, a firm, steady pressure against the waves of pain. She was not a midwife, but she was a woman who knew suffering, and in that moment, it was enough. She poured all of her own lost hopes, all of her own buried maternal love, into this single act of creation. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, with the wind shrieking like a banshee, the baby came. A raw, piercing cry cut through the storm, a sound of such fierce, defiant life that it seemed to silence the wind itself. It was a girl, small and red and perfect. Clara cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a warm blanket, her hands moving with a sureness that felt like a miracle. She placed the child in Mary's arms. Mary looked down at her daughter, her face awash with tears of relief and joy. Then she looked up at Clara, and her eyes held no fear, no judgment. They held only a profound, bottomless gratitude that transcended every ugly word that had ever passed between them. In that moment, Clara was not the cursed widow. She was a savior. Word of what she had done spread through the town as the snows melted. It traveled faster than gossip. A story of courage and compassion that began to chip away at the hard shell of the town's opinion. The women in the general store no longer fell silent when she entered. They would offer a stiff, hesitant nod. One of them, Mrs. Miller's sister, even pressed a small jar of apple butter into her hand, muttering a thank you before hurrying away. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of acceptance, just as a fragile peace began to settle over their lives. A new threat appeared. This one, not from a man with a torch, but a man with a contract. A well-dressed stranger rode into town and went directly to Eli's cabin. He was an agent for a large cattle operation in a neighboring county, a place of lush grasslands and wealthy ranchers. They had heard of Eli, of his resilience and his skill with cattle. They offered him the position of ranch foreman. It was a job that came with a good house, a handsome salary, and the kind of respect he would never find in redemption. Eli didn't speak of it for days, but a new quietness settled over him, a thoughtful, troubled distance that worried Clara more than any open conflict. This was a real opportunity, a path to an easier life, a life he deserved. She saw him looking at his burned-down barn, at his small herd, at the hard, unforgiving land, and she saw the temptation in his eyes. Clara said nothing. She could not. To ask him to stay would be to chain him to her own broken life, to this hard-scrabble existence, her old shame. The voice that told her she was a curse whispered that he would be better off without her. She deserved a life of struggle. He deserved a life of peace. So she kept silent, her heart aching with the words she could not say, and a cold fear began to grow that he would make the sensible choice and leave. One evening, the weight of it became too much to bear. She fled to the creek, the place where she had first seen his scars, the place that felt like the heart of their shared land. She sat on a rock by the water's edge, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pink, and she wept. The tears were not the wild, ragged sobs of her past grief, but the silent, heartbroken tears of a woman who was about to lose the only good thing she had ever known. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence behind her, a familiar warmth against the cooling air. He sat down on the rock beside her, not speaking, just waiting. "You should take the job, Eli," she said finally, her voice thick, her gaze fixed on the swirling water. "It's a good life, a better life than this." She turned to look at him, her face wet with tears. "I know you deserve more than a ruined woman and a piece of cursed land. He listened, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He looked at her, at the genuine, selfless sorrow in her eyes. He saw that she was willing to let him go, to sacrifice her own happiness for his. He stood up, walked to the edge of the creek, and looked down at the water. Then, in a single, fluid motion, he took off his hat, the dusty, sweat-stained symbol of his lonely, wandering life, and he tossed it into the creek. It landed with a soft splash and began to float away on the current, a dark shape disappearing into the twilight. Clara stared, her breath caught in her throat. He turned back to her, his head bare under the rising moon, his eyes holding an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "Only thing I want's here," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper that was more binding than any vow. He walked back to her, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her. The kiss was not the hesitant exploration of their first, nor the desperate claiming of their second. It was slow and deep, a culmination of everything they had survived. It was a kiss of promises kept and fears overcome. It tasted of wood smoke and winter and the salty tang of her tears. And then, in the middle of it, she felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, a breathless, joyous sound of pure relief. He pulled back, a slow smile spreading across his own face, and kissed her again. A kiss full of moonlight and breathless, tear-streaked laughter. From that day on, the change was slow but steady. Eli rebuilt his barn, and Clara was there every day, handing him nails, holding boards steady. The town watched. On Sundays, a community potluck was often held in the churchyard after the service. One week, Clara baked an apple pie, using the jar of apple butter the Miller girl's aunt had given her, and she walked with Eli to the gathering. The whispers did not stop entirely, but their venom was gone. Mrs. Gable gave her a stiff nod of acknowledgement. Mary Miller, holding her beautiful baby girl, gave her a warm, genuine smile. They were no longer outcasts. They were just Clara and Eli, children, who had once been shushed and pulled away from her, now offered shy waves as she passed. One clear, cold morning in early spring, when the first green shoots were beginning to push through the muddy soil, Clara knew it was time. She walked out of her cabin and into the woods, to a small, sun-dappled clearing where she had buried the tiny, blanket-wrapped bundle all those years ago in her mind. There was no marker, no stone, just a place she had held in her heart. Eli followed her, but he stopped at the edge of the clearing, giving her the space she needed. He stood with his back against a tall pine, his hat in his hands, a silent, patient guardian. Clara knelt on the damp earth, the chill seeping through her dress. She closed her eyes and spoke to the child she had never known, not with the choked, guilty sobs of the past, but with the quiet calm of a woman who had finally found her way. "Hello, little one," she whispered to the silent ground. "It's been a long time. I wanted you to know. Mama found peace." She stayed there for a long time, the silence of the woods a gentle comfort. When she finally stood and turned to leave, her face was serene. She walked back to Eli, and he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and they walked back to their life without a word. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley. Clara sat on the porch of her cabin, the porch Eli had fixed, her hands resting in her lap. She was no longer watching for trouble on the horizon. She was waiting for him. Soon, she saw him, a familiar, beloved silhouette riding up from the fields, his day's work done. As he drew near the cabin, he looked at her, and his face broke into a slow, easy smile. He lifted his hand to the brim of his hat and tipped it to her, the same gesture of quiet respect he had offered on the very first day. But now, it was a greeting, a promise, a homecoming. She smiled back, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. And as he dismounted, she stood and opened her arms. "Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.